Distinguished heads of state, heads of government, and foreign ministers from around the globe will arrive in New York City on September 22, 2011, for the United Nations 10th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action General Assembly High-Level Meeting, better known as Durban III. Supposedly, they will devote themselves to the elimination of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, just as they did in Durban I in South Africa, where Yasser Arafat said Israel represents racial discrimination in its ugliest form and images, and just as they did in Durban II in Geneva, where Iran's President Ahmadinejad spoke.
و جامعه جهانی را شرمنده ساخته است. صهیونیسم جهانی مظهر تمام عیار نژاد پرستی است که با توسل دروغین به دین کوشیده است.
It's no secret that condemning racism at the Durban conferences means condemning, isolating, and delegitimizing Israel. Legitimacy. That is what is at stake at Durban III. The legitimacy of anti-Semitism. In 1975, only 30 years after the United Nations was founded on the ashes of 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust, the General Assembly adopted a resolution equating Zionism, the self-determination of the Jewish people, with racism and racial discrimination. When this poisonous act was finally rescinded 16 years later, in 1991, Arab and Muslim states, which had rejected Israel from the day of its birth, searched for another method of resurrecting the same libel. In 2001, they found their answer, the Durban Declaration, which condemned only one state for racism among all 192 UN member nations, Israel. Palestinians were entitled victims of Israeli racism. The 2001 UN spectacle was not an advance in race relations, but a descent into another virulent form of anti-Semitism, the Racist Anti-Racism Conference. The United States, led by Holocaust survivor and Congressman Tom Lantos, walked out. UN-empowered anti-Semites were unfazed, with Islamic states and their allies in the driver's seat at the UN Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly. They decided to hold a second Durban conference in 2009 with the sole purpose of rescuing the Durban Declaration from the dustbin of history by reaffirming it. The only world leader to show up for the occasion was Ahmadinejad. Walkouts by democratic states ensued. One person who did not walk out was the UN's top human rights authority, Nave Pillay, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. On the final day of Durban II, Pillay declared it a resounding success. Why? Because as she told the press, the Durban Declaration and its attention on Palestinian victims of Israeli racism had been reaffirmed. The demonization of Israel campaign by the UN rolled on. For over 50 years, 82% of all the UN General Assembly emergency session meetings have been about condemning Israel. Genocides in Cambodia? None. Rwanda? Nil. Sudan? Zero. In its history, the UN Human Rights Council, the UN's premier human rights institution, has adopted resolutions and decisions critical of specific states. 47% condemn Israel alone. In 2010, the UN General Assembly criticized specific countries for human rights violations. 78% condemned only Israel. If one adds up all the human rights criticisms of specific countries by all UN human rights related bodies, in 2010, Israel is on top. Fifth most condemned was the United States. Iran was 11th. Syria, 22nd. And still, UN operators were not satisfied. Legitimacy continued to plague the Durban Declaration. After all, the world leaders gracing the stages of Durban I and II had been Fidel Castro, Yasser Arafat, and Ahmadinejad, men whose human rights credentials needed work. So Nave Pillay and her peers hatched a new plan. Durban III, New York City, opening week of the General Assembly, which means not one, not two, but over 100 world leaders will be on hand to applaud the Durban Declaration, finally bestowing the legitimacy that has so long eluded it. Durban I ended 3 days before 9/11. So while Americans will be remembering the 10th anniversary of the terrible consequences of hate and intolerance, the United Nations will be commemorating the 10th anniversary of global hate-mongering itself. Please join us in denying legitimacy to prejudice and its Durban Declaration. Join the front lines and our online counter-conference at www.durbanwatch.com.